Hello, today I'd like to talk about studying fake news, and I want to start off with the research question, or a kind of generic one, and that it would be: to what extent does fake news, which we could also refer to as misinformation, resonate in political spaces across social media in the run-up to whichever national elections? Now, this is a generic question. Oftentimes, fake news is studied um, in the run-up to national or other elections. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about one in particular, and that is the presidential elections in the US in 2020. So this is the sort of reformulated, more specific research question: to what extent does fake news resonate in political spaces across social media in the run-up to the presidential elections in the US? Now, I've asterisked three terms there, and we're going to go into them one by one. Um, the Starting from the last one, the presidential elections, and then we'll talk about um, political spaces and how to demarcate them, or what one can do in order to demarcate them, and then the tricky term, fake news, and the fact that it's a classification problem, and it's also one that is politicized. So we'll talk about that. So first, as I said, oftentimes so-called fake news is studied in relation to elections. Of course, this is because of the sort of birth of the fake news crisis, which was in connection with the 2016 US presidential elections. And this birth, you could argue, was from a particular news article that was written by Craig Silverman that appeared in November of 2016 with this quite shocking graphic where the headline read, "This analysis shows how viral fake election news stories outperformed real news on Facebook." Now, there are a couple of studies that he had done with colleagues prior to it. He was the one who discovered the Macedonian fake news farm, and which was producing first initially stories um, that favored Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, but they weren't earning enough money, so they switched to Trump. And the stories that they were putting out uh, got quite a lot of engagement. There was a subsequent story, and then this one in November is when he actually used the term fake news. And in the story, he used fake news, the term, also rather interchangeably with false news. But nevertheless, this graphic and then the headline is in some ways the sort of birth of the fake news crisis, and that is the crisis being that it outperforms mainstream news, and it did so right before the 2016 elections. And this is on Facebook, of course. Now, what is interesting about this particular article, and this is the definition that they use for fake news, and it includes um, sort of imposter sites, so sites or pages that are purporting to be real news organizations, which are not. Um, there are now and again considered some sort of conspiracy sources, but mainly the other one is hyper partisan. And this is an interesting term, which we'll break down in a minute. But what Silverman did also with his colleagues is they did a qualitative determination. So they looked at the stories, and from a journalistic kind of using kind of fact checking eye, and they made this determination. So, and then subsequently there were many so-called fake news studies that were done prior to European elections, and so Sweden, Germany, France, the Netherlands. So this is the sort of typical um, subject matter, but also there's a lot of misinformation studies, of course, done around the pandemic, or the so-called infodemic, and around other sort of health information, etc. So elections and pandemics so to speak, or those are the favorite sort of rather bounded events, bounded in a sort of time frame. And then you can do like this a sort of time series analysis. So is it getting, is the problem getting worse? Is it improving, etc.? Is Facebook doing enough? Okay, so then the second aspect is in the research question about the extent to which fake news resonates in political spaces across social media in the run up to a national election. So, what are these political spaces? Well, political spaces are oftentimes, and this is a term that is sometimes used, but you can also drop the term. But what you're doing is you are creating a set. So you're building a list of queries, and then you're querying them in the platforms, and you're getting results back. And these results are then sets, source sets, which are oftentimes ranked by engagement. And then you're checking these sources for misinformation or quote unquote fake news. So these are these political spaces, and you can build your lists and query across social media platforms, from the public facing ones to the more anonymous or masked ones like 4chan and Reddit, and then get some sort of sense of the extent to which the misinformation problem is across all platforms, or whether it's more a problem of one or two, etc. So here today, you see that Facebook there is bolded. I'm going to talk specifically about Facebook, and not go through all these other platforms. But at the end, there's a bibliography where there are resources where we've studied all these other platforms as well, and the how-tos will be there. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, when you build a list prior to an election, the straightforward parts of the list are the politicians' names. Normally, you want the party leaders or the main candidates, the party names, and then you want to make a list as well of election issues. You can also add the name of the election as well. I haven't put that on here, but you can have the name of the election. Oftentimes, if you're querying, the reason it's not on here is if you're querying Twitter and you're querying hashtags, then there's normally one or two dominant hashtags for a particular election. But here it's the list of politicians' names, the party names, as well as election issues. Now, you can do the election issues in a couple of different ways. Sort of the most straightforward way is to make a generic issue list. And you see that here in the UK for YouGov. And you see that these are quite generic names, and you can use those terms to query. But when you do, you probably want to also add the word election, because otherwise those terms are too broad. Or you can do it a little bit more in a sophisticated manner and and use the party platforms. So on the screen, you'll notice that there's a sort of issue list from the Democratic Party in the US, and you could see that they have quite specific terminology. So then you're using party-related issue language. So here, it's slightly more complicated, because you'll create issue lists per party. Sometimes they'll overlap, sometimes they won't. You probably want to retain the specificity per party and query all of the terms to see whether or not the misinformation problem, if there is one, is related to a particular party far more than other parties, or whether it's across the board. Now, once you have your list of politicians' names, the party names, as well as the issues, however you're going to do it, then there are a couple of ways for gathering Facebook data. So these are two of them. These use or repurpose tools that have been developed for different reasons, and for marketing, largely marketing research, although the CrowdTangle tool is now being used by, routinely being used by academic researchers. So there's CrowdTangle, and here you can study which Facebook pages are resonating. Um, right, so which you query, and then you see which you query, and so you see which Facebook pages are engaged with, and you see the example here. I put in Social Security. You don't have to use quotation marks, that there are for exact searches, and you have a date range there, and you're returning the data by total interactions. So this is the engagement source. So it'll be a ranked list of those pages that, like in some ways what Craig Silverman did, those pages that are being engaged with. Or Silverman in fact used BuzzSumo, which is a marketing tool. And when you query that, you will use the quotation marks. There are also a couple of other settings you can. There's for a particular region setting. There's also a language setting that you'll want to use. And then what you are returned here are web URLs. And in fact, this is how we did the study. We used BuzzSumo, and you get, so the query here is climate change, and you get a sort of ranked list of URLs. So with the date of the post, the host, but then beneath that is a clickable link to the story, which is important, which we'll come to, and then the engagement score. So the number of times it's been liked, shared, commented upon, or reacted upon, more broadly. Okay, the third part of the research question is fake news or misinformation. Now, this is as I said, it's a difficult classification problem. It's also politicized. So I want to take you first to Silverman's sort of idea from BuzzFeed News, idea of fake news. So he basically had two, three, alluded to a fourth definition. So the first type of quote unquote fake news source is what he referred to as sort of imposters, or sites that purport to be a news organization when in fact they're not. So that's number one. The second one is he used this term hyper-partisan. So the term itself was put into play by John Herman of the New York Times a couple of months before Silverman's study. So he used this term hyperpartisan. He also was connected to Facebook, how quote unquote hyperpartisan sources, so sources with a sort of clear ideology, prone to hyperbole, were doing rather well on Facebook. And then the second one, or the third one, he uses the term misinformation. That's why I have it in parentheses in the research question. He doesn't explicitly refer to conspiracy, although in related articles it does come up. But nevertheless, if you look at the top five sort of quote unquote fake news election stories, you see that the top four are from one type. These are the quote unquote hyperpartisan. And then the fifth one, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead in apartment, murder, suicide. Denver Guardian. Denver Guardian sounds like a real news organization. However, it's not. It's an imposter. And so he talks about these two types in particular, and then these are the examples. The other ones, the one that resonated the most is the Pope endorsing Trump, which was on this Facebook page, which also has a URL, but this is from the Facebook page, which is which he discusses as this remarkably successful, utterly untrustworthy site, which does not publicly list an owner or an editor. And this is an important piece of information here, because then it gets you into how journalists oftentimes evaluate sources, do particular source criticism on the basis of journalistic standards. But before we go there, I just want to talk a little bit. So this is Silverman's definition. This is the broad definition of fake news. And as I said, he uses he defines them as both imposter as well as hyperpartisan, sometimes alluding to conspiracy. I've also added here disinformation, which is oftentimes part of this larger definition, like Russian IRA influence campaigning, this sort of thing. So this is, and so that's where the line is drawn, so to speak, when beginning to classify different kinds of sources as you come across. So this is one way of looking at this fake news. Now, another way is if you move this line up and do not include hyperpartisan sources as part of this definition of fake news and or misinformation. And this is, in fact, what Facebook does when in their definition, what they call false news. But also some journalists. So the one that I'm referring to in the published study is a Dutch quality newspaper called the NRC Handelsblad. And when they did their own sort of evaluation of stories in the run up to the Dutch elections, they didn't include hyper partisan or tabloid or these sorts of sources as being quote unquote fake or misinformation. Rather, their definition was quite strict, like Facebook. So these are the two. Now I want to begin with how the journalistic organizations and media organizations begin to think about sources as being problematic or not. So what you see here is a tool called NewsGuard. It's also a plugin you can install it in your browser. And then when you go to a particular source, like the two here, ChristianityToday.com or OANN.com, it gives you a quote unquote nutrition label. And it's about the extent to which they meet particular journalistic standards. So you see Christianity Today meets a lot of them, whereas the other source does not. And so you see how sort of problematic information, misinformation, fake news begins to be addressed as something to be classified by news organizations. Now, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about this notion of hyperpartisan. So as I mentioned before, and as you saw, it was this defined by John Herman as openly ideological web operation. So it's both highly ideological on the one hand, but then also this internet or web phenomenon on the other. So there are a number of different, sort of, let's call them media monitoring sites, which classify sources, and they classify them according to quote unquote their neutrality. So how neutral are they? And then they put them on a political spectrum. And you see the media bias chart. It's also oftentimes referred to just as the chart. One of them, where they also have picked up this term, hyperpartisan. Now this one was published in 2018. So you see that there's a sort of something of a continuum here, where particular sources are classified. And there's one here in the UK, this fightingfake.org.uk, which also sort of classifies sources as such. Now, the the one uses the term hyperpartisan, the other one doesn't, but the ones that are on the farthest ends, so to speak, and so from the media bias chart, those would be the two, so the hyperpartisan and the most extreme, and then that's on both sides of the political spectrum. And then for the fighting fake, it would be just the left or the right would be considered more partisan, although you could also think of some of them here as hyperpartisan if you look at the URLs. And this is how it's done. So there's a sort of scoring system. So this is this media bias fact check, which is another one of these sort of media monitoring organizations that then classifies them according to political leaning. Now, what's interesting is that one can make use of these to do this sort of work. But I want, before we make use of them, I want to point out something interesting. So you look on the all sides, and you notice that on the left, sort of the light blue, you see the New York Times, and then the farther on the left, the dark blue, you see New York Times opinion. Okay, so what this alerts you to is the fact that you probably want to do your classification on a story level as opposed to a source level, because it differentiates in this particular case between the news and the editorial as being slightly different. So this is the first point. So the New York Times is in this, and by all sides, is not hyper partisan, but it's according to all sides, their opinion is. So that's number one. So, but we can consider triangulating these. So I mean, these are all considered of decent quality. I mean, there are some issues with all of them, but nevertheless, we could consider using all of these sources, and then if there's disagreement, using the majority classification. Yeah, so this is so we're in some ways outsourcing the classification to these media monitoring organizations, who themselves profess different levels of neutrality. Now, so what we do then is you had your lists, you queried them in the software, you got back the results. In this case, web URLs, they are ranked by engagement score, and now we're going to classify them. And we're going to classify them in two ways. So they're going to be classified as sort of mainstream or problematic, and problematic is sort of what we were talking about as quote unquote fake news or misinformation. That is to say, in the sort of narrower definition. So imposter, disinformation, conspiracy, this would be that. So here you have businessinsider.com, motherjones.com, USA Today. So none of those here are considered problematic. They're all considered mainstream. But we have another column, where we are considering whether they are hyperpartisan or even partisan. So on here, well, hyperpartisan, liberal, most extreme liberal, not the skews, but the dark. So the dark blue L and the dark red R, and then it's from all sides, and then the most extreme liberal, hyperpartisan liberal, and then the hyperpartisan conservative, most extreme conservative. So Mother Jones, in fact, you see here is hyperpartisan liberal, so we put it there. as where you just use the term progressive, you could also use the term liberal. So this is so there's two classifications: a main classification and a subclassification. So now we're ready for the analysis. And so let's return to the research question: what extent does fake news and misinformation resonate in the political spaces? So this will now be in Facebook in the run up to the presidential elections in the US in 2020. So we can look at, let's say, the amount of it, right? But this amount we can also compare to what Silverman found in his work. So, and we'll do the comparison by proportions, just in a very straightforward way. The second thing is, because we had this differentiation, this two classifications, so the one being mainstream versus problematic, the other one is whether it's hyperpartisan or not. We can also look at the difference definitions, the scale of the problem according to a narrower and a broader definition of quote unquote fake news. And then finally, we can look into its politicization by examining the extent to which the hyperpartisan sources, which could be classified in the broader definition as quote unquote fake news, whether they tend to be more conservative or tend to be more progressive. And so we can see that in some ways the politics of fake news classification used in this third one. Okay, so let's look now. So the data here, we're just running data from the first quarter in 2020 and comparing it then to the first quarter in 2016. And we have very simple proportions that we're using. And what's interesting is that this is then the broad definition. So Silverman's definition. So we're including in this particular one the hyperpartisan. And you see that in fact the problem, the misinformation problem or the fake news problem on Facebook has worsened slightly. So there's a bit more of it than there was in the first quarter of 2016 and the run up to into the elections. However, if you compare the broad definition with the narrower one, so there's sort of false news, right? So then you're not including hyperpartisan sources. The problem is much smaller. So whereas it was 1 in 3.5, now it's 1 in 9. So the problem gets reduced quite a lot, which I guess you would imagine, but nevertheless it's quite stark. Now, moving to the question of the politics, here we see that when that the hyperpartisan conservative sources are far more present in those that have been most engaged with than the progressive ones. So you see the politics of fake news classification quite starkly. So if we use the broad definition and we count hyperpartisan sources as quote unquote fake or misinformation, then what you're basically doing is you're labeling a lot of conservative sources as that and far fewer progressive ones as such. So in terms of the implications, so if we have the broad definition, the problem is quite large, which might imply that it would be addressed by sort of automated means, or that one might think that that the problem can't be addressed. But if we do the narrower definition, the problem gets smaller. It's still not that small, but nevertheless, one could begin to consider different forms of fact checking or sort of crowdsourcing solutions, quote unquote. Okay, so this is the first implication, but the other one is what I brought up here at the end, and that is thinking about the larger question of the politics of demarcation. So if we're classify and call a lot of the hyper partisan conservative sources as fake, then you are politicizing, and you will likely, as we have seen over the past few years, get a particular form of political backlash. Um, so here the works I've referenced, Craig Silverman's work, the famous sort of birth of the fake news crisis article, John Herman's coinage of the term hyper partisan, and then the further readings where you can dig in deeper to how to study them across multiple platforms, and do sort of a kind of fake news study uh, with a cross-platform approach. Okay, well, thank you very much.